Now we're going to look at the Essence standard. So what is Essence? We know that it's a standard. It's a standard with stratified by the OMG. And what does it contain? It contains two things. So the Essence standard is a combination of the kernel and the language. The kernel is a slightly odd word, but the kernel represents the common ground. So when we think about the history of Essence and the time where there was lots of these competing methods, and the idea was that you just needed to spot the flaws in the old method, make a new method that was better, and everybody would get to your new method. The problem with that was there was so many things across those methods that were similar. And part of Essence was about identifying what that common ground is and describing it in a way that was uncontroversial, that was kind of inarguably true, and that was genuinely a common ground that practices and methods would be built upon. It wasn't seeking to be a replacement method. And one thing that's quite important and often misconstrued about Essence is that it is a method. You don't adopt Essence and replace something else with Essence. You bring Essence in, and if you've got nothing, you might start with Essence. But if you've got a way of working, you bring Essence in as effectively a lens to look at how you work. And that lens is that common ground. And you can relate everything you do to the common ground, and you can use the bits of the kernel that we'll talk about in a second to see where you are, to see which bits you do successfully. Are there bits of it that you neglect or do poorly? And does it give you ideas as to where you can improve or do things better? So the kernel is quite an important part of Essence. Equally important is the language. And the language is used to describe the kernel as well. So there's a relationship between them. And we talk about Essence being used to describe practices and methods. And one of the really key things about Essence is the language itself is really simple. There are just four things. And those are the same things, largely, that are in the kernel. So the language describes the things we work with. What is it that we progress? What do we do? What's the purpose of us doing work? What do we change the state of? It describes the things that we create. It describes the things that we do. And it describes how we do them in terms of guidance and patterns. So the language has just got, largely speaking, those four key things. Things we progress, things we create, the things we do, and guidance to help us. And the kernel describes the common ground in terms of things we work with, things we do, and the competencies, so the skill and competence required in the team to be successful. And because it's the common ground, that's why we talk about it being the essential things. So the kernel is the essential things that describe the common ground. The language is the mechanism by which we can add a whole range of richness with practices that sit on top. We'll talk about authoring in another section, and we'll go into the language a little bit more there. And we'll see the language in a bit more in a second. But first, let's take a little bit of a look at the common ground. Now, I could read through all these things on the left. There's 15 of them. They're called activity spaces. We've got the 7 competencies, 6 competencies in the middle, and we've got the 7, what Essence calls alphas on the right. But instead, what I'd like you to do is not to think about each of these in detail, because that's going to take more time, but to just look at them holistically and ask yourself this question. Do these things make sense to me? If I'm developing technology solutions, are these things that I do? No, I might not call them exactly those words. So these things on the left, do I explore possibilities? Do I understand my stakeholder needs? Do I use the system? Do I support the team? Do I prepare to do the work? I'm going to guess that you do. Now, you might use a particular thing. You might use an element of, say, Scrum or Safe or Kanban. But underneath the hood, that's what you're doing. And in the middle are the basic competencies that your team uses, things around helping understand and represent the stakeholders, develop and test and analyze the requirements in your solution, and leading and managing the team and the work. And then across the 3, we've got these colors. And the colors represent things to do with the customer things to do with the solution, and things to do with the endeavor, the work that we're doing. And on the right, we have these things to work with. And we'll talk more about them when we come to talk about states and progress and measuring progress with state. But think of these as the critical things that we progress. These are alphas in essence, and an alpha is something that a practice will have, but there's also practice alphas at the kernel level. And they're things that have state that we progress through. So are our stakeholders involved? Is our team performing? That's a state. When we think about states and we think about what it means to be in a state, we again have a whole set of really important things that all teams do. Every single team has a requirement that goes through different states through until it's addressed. Every single team has stakeholders that go through states of being recognized and involved and so on, eventually getting benefit from the system. There's a lot of detail underneath these words, and that's why the standard is 300 pages. What's important with this, though, is to recognize that these are the common ground things that all teams do. And if you're doing these things really well, fine. If it turns out that you think, I could do with some help testing the system, that's when you reach for a practice. And then you bring a practice in that's written in that language, and it tells me specifically extra things I can do to test the system, maybe some extra alphas I want to track the state of, maybe some extra work products that I want to create, maybe some extra guidance and patterns that will help me test my system better. So you can use this as a bit of a kind of matrix of things that if I'm happy here, I don't need to do anything else. But if I want some support, I'll go get a practice to help me. The second part of the kernel then is the language. And I've already talked a little bit about this. We've got alpha, which is our core thing we care about, that we're progressing. We progress through different states. Each alpha has a number of states. We have work products, which are the things that we create, documents, models. They've got a purpose, right? They're going to be describing what state we're in. Therefore, we look for evidence that we're in a given state. We do things called activities, and when we do an activity, we're doing it for one of two reasons, or at least one of two reasons. We're either moving to a new state or staying in the state that we're in, or we're creating a work product, or we're doing some combination of that. If we don't know what the activity is for, we've got to wonder whether we need to do it. Similarly, if we've got a state that we haven't got an activity that helps us get to, how do we reach that state? Is there a missing activity? So you can start to see that these relationships between these elements give us a consistency and a coherence that makes our practices more rounded and more successful, more correct. This is the reason why when I create a new practice from, for example, a proprietary in-house practice from a company, often you find these questions come up. You've got an activity that you do, but it doesn't seem to progress an alpha or result in a work product. Or you seem to care a lot about being in this state, but you've not got an activity that helps you get there. So it allows you to spot gaps in the logic of how people have got existing practices. And then elsewhere on the board, we've got competence. So it's very often the case that just doing an activity isn't sufficient. You've got to have the skill and competence to do it well. So sometimes you'll want to specify what level of skill or competence is required for this activity to be successful. And then the pattern, in essence, is a really powerful language element because it helps provide a lot of guidance and a lot of advice. So, for example, it might provide guidance on particular terminology or definitions. It might give you ideas on how to run an activity or what people are responsible for it. And the resources will maybe point you at templates for documents or further references, articles, web pages, books, things like that. So you've got a bunch of supporting information as well. So that's a brief skim over the Essence standard, the kernel and the language. And the important thing to remember is that the kernel is really about this common ground, and it describes in quite a lot of detail that we didn't want to go into in this talk about what that means. And it's helping you make sure you're making progress in the right way. And then we plug in practices on top that add an extra level of detail. So they add extra specific activities, specific work activities, potentially specific extra alphas that are things that we track, and they all help us progress through that common ground from exploring possibilities to having the value demonstrated to us, or value being received by stakeholders, and ultimately systems being retired.